Good morning in the UK, in England, and Europe, pretty much just about afternoon. Good evening to those dialing in from the East, and good super early morning to folks if you're dialing in from the US. Thank you for joining us. Really excited as always to be here on this webinar. I love webinars. They're a really interesting way to get a lot of information out in a very short space of time. Before we begin, a couple of quick hygiene topics. Remember, you can always come back and listen in if there is a fire, save your life, switch off your mobile if you can, or at least put it in mute so that you don't get disrupted. You can ask us questions. You can also get in touch with info@cm, as in China, Mama, -alliance.com if you have any questions. And you can always listen in to the webinar later on. Do give us feedback at the end, and we're going to dive straight in. There's quite a lot of things we're going to discuss. And basically, the topic of today is killing multiple regulatory birds. We don't want to kill them, but you know where this is coming from, with one solution, with one approach, with one chain of thought. Deduplicating your effort, saving time, money, and stress. So before we carry on, bookmark the Cyber Management Alliance channel. There are several downloads on this webinar. If you take a look at attachments and links, we're also giving away the presentation. You can take it and use it and modify it. And there are several previous webinars that are very, very insightful and still very relevant today. Moving forward, the people joining you today, presenting is myself there on the left, but Chris, I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Thank you very much, and pleasure to be here as always. Hello to everybody who's listening in. My name is Chris Payne. I'm the Managing Director of Advanced Cyber Solutions, and we are an IT security solutions and professional services provider. We are based in the UK, but we have customers in 7 countries, including the US and, of course, a lot of European countries. And happy to talk about today's topic today.
Chris, thank you so much. Myself, I'm the guy with the blue turban on the left. I am a practicing CISO, Information Security Manager Officer. Also officially known as the Chief Blame Officer, the title for CISO. I run Cyber Management Alliance, Wisdom of Crowds, and Chris is a very good friend, and we work with Chris on many, many different projects. Okay, so we get to the meat and the main topics here. But before we go on, Chris, shall we start the question? So I am going to start the vote. Give me a list. Give me a second. Back to list. Polls added. Okay. Everyone listening in, if you take a look at the bottom of your screen where you are listening, if you make that full screen, we have a question for you. How many compliance, regulatory, industry standards do you have to comply with and uphold? Please do take a moment and answer this question. We'll leave the survey open for several minutes and encourage everyone to take part and give us what they have to comply with. If you have none, it's fine. But if you look at the screen right now, ISACA couldn't have put it better. Organizations are being burdened with an unprecedented volume of regulatory and compliance requirements. Chris, what are your thoughts on this? But when I deal with clients, Chris, what we see is people are scared of compliance. People understand, they do understand a little bit why they have to do it, but they are overburdened. And in certain industries, the critical national infrastructure, the banking, there is an onslaught of compliance requirements that is not going to stop.
Yeah, there is, isn't there? And I don't think a day goes by now where I'm not speaking to somebody who's trying to implement some control or some solution because of a regulation or a standard that they're attempting to achieve. And it's almost become it's almost become telling for our time. I think in the last 3 years, the number of regulations and standards has increased quite dramatically. I don't have any particular statistics, but if you think about this year alone, in Europe, you've got GDPR, which occupied our conversations for the last 2 years. You've also got the NIS, the Network and Information Security Directive. You've got changes to PCI, and the list goes on and on. So in some respects, you almost wonder if information security or IT security has been completely replaced by regulatory and compliance standards. Probably a big win for the compliance team, but people like myself who have worked in IT security for a number of years wonder what happened to our industry. It used to be based on risk. Now it's just about following a mandate.
Yes, and the screen that we have, thanks Chris, the screen that we have here, Chris, the way I look at it, and folks listening in, like I said, I deal with many different kinds of clients, banking, publishing, government, etc., etc. I think the challenge here is, and what I see, Chris, there's a fundamental problem with the approach to compliance. Chris and I just came up with that word before we joined, right? There is too much focus on the on the compliance element of the compliance requirement, if I may, rather than understanding what is the spirit of the compliance. And it's not an easy thing to balance, especially for auditors, if your team has internal auditors. Trust me, I know the pain and I know the challenges of dealing with internal and external auditors. And in many times, they have to, the nature of their job, Chris, they have to take a binary approach to compliance, right? And that creates a problem for the business, because if the auditor is taking a binary approach to compliance, it stifles what I believe is that creative element to compliance, which is what is the compliance actually asking you to do. Now, I know people who write these kind of things, and I've kind of been involved in some at different levels. The problem is, and the challenge is, when people are writing these regulations, they are going to use monikers, vocabulary, taxonomy that is maybe relevant to their culture. A very good example for those listening in, everyone, India, quite a good example actually, Chris. India has just, if I may, taken inspiration from GDPR, it's the best way to put it, and created their own privacy, it's not law yet, I think, but they're looking at making it law. And whoever has time on this should maybe take a read at it. And what you will notice, it's pretty much the same thing. It's taken its own cultural taxonomy, its own judicial regulatory vocabulary, and kind of wrapped it up in that particular context. Now, for an organization who has an office in India and an office in the UK, they are now going to start panicking. They're now going to spend a lot of money trying to, first of all, understand what it is saying, but also then making sure that they can tick the box. What are your thoughts on that, Chris? Because I know you also face similar challenges when you talk to your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot to talk about there, by the way, and I've been scribbling some notes down almost like a politician on TV, so I can answer everything that you mentioned there. Not the best comparison to make, but so the slide that's on the screen at the moment, there's some interesting things on here. Firstly, I'm sure a lot of people can empathize with the image of the man who's just drowning in paperwork, and that tends to be a reality for a lot of IT managers, CISOs, or anybody occupying that kind of executive role of IT in a business. The second thing to note is we put a timeline down here of some of the regulatory standards and industry standards and law that have come out, particularly around critical national infrastructure, obviously making sure that we're focusing on the people that are attending this webinar. And this is, of course, not an exhaustive list, right? This is just all I could fit on the slide. But what I really wanted to get what the point I really wanted to get across here was the increase, the complete, absolute exponential increase in the requirements on organizations in the past, not just a year, but let's say the past 3 years. It's been huge, and not just new regulations, but also evolving. PCI is a new version of it. ISO ISO 27001 at least was revised in 2013. So there's been this exponential rise in the requirements in organizations to have to follow these mandates, and there's good reason for it. If you think about the last 5 years, there have been some pretty embarrassing and large-scale breaches, disclosures, outages, lots of, you can Google this stuff and get as many news articles as you want. And the answer from governments and industries has been to regulate, force companies to do things in order to bring the minimum standard up to a certain height. This is not new. You're all aware of this. But the issue that's come about, and I don't want to reveal too much, but the poll, I can see the poll results, and without revealing the surprise, Amar, 59% of our respondents said they had to comply with more than 3, so that's 4 or more, compliance, regulatory or industry standards. Now, the problem with that is the thinking tends to be siloed. So large organizations in particular will have a PCI team, they may have a GDPR team, they may have a SWIFT team if they're in banking. And that siloed approach, that siloed way of thinking creates inefficiencies, which led me to create the title of Deduplication as a little bit of a joke. What we really need to do is get into this thinking of integrated compliance, right? What is the actual outcome for the business overall? We need to comply with these 4 things. Where are those commonalities, and how can we speak about those?
No, totally. So apologies to the audience. Someone raised an alert about breaking up audio. We apologize for that. It's not something we have control over. We will try to speak a bit slower so that everyone can get in. Please keep the feedback and the questions coming in. Chris, integrated compliance, and this goes back to what I was saying. If those siloed departments, it's now, for those listening in, 62% of you, no one has chosen no compliance. So there's 0% of the audience have no compliance requirements, as in everyone has some compliance requirements. But it's quite interesting and kind of enlightening, actually, to see 62% of you have 4 or more compliance requirements in industry standards that you have to, manage. Now, the siloed departments, whether it's managed by one or multiple departments, Chris, my problem, and I think what you see, but when I also talk to a lot of clients, is they're operating in a silo where they are not able to see what we are talking about on our screen now is the element of commonality, right, as we have in this over here, as the element of, context, and taking a slightly more creative element to the complianceification word that we've come up with. There is this constant struggle. If you look at the screen we have in front of us that we created, Chris, and folks listening in, these can be siloed departments in many, many large organizations. And they are working, they are buying tools, they are creating large spreadsheets, and whatever they're doing, they're trying to tick the box for that particular table. Rather than what you and I are proposing, for everyone listening in today, is actually, why don't you take a slightly more holistic approach and take a step back and look at this and say, oh, you know what? We could actually address this particular requirement from these 3 tables with one approach.
Correct, and a lot of the people that I speak to who do follow the idea of integrated compliance, they recognize this fact very, very quickly, because you see the issue with siloed departments is, and especially when we compare it to our poll question, you potentially are quadrupling your effort. If you're complying with 4 different standards or 4 different regulations, and you've got siloed teams, there is guaranteed to be overlap. And the reason why we can make that guarantee is very simple. A lot, or in fact probably all, of the different compliance mandates and regulations out there tend to have some kind of existing regulation or standard as a source of inspiration. And you can see that, and quite often it's actually ISO 27001. But if you take, for example, something like the Cyber Essentials in the UK, it's a very basic level of security that most organizations can and should achieve. It's a certification, and that effectively is borrowed from some of the principles of ISO 27001. So, you know, it stands to reason that if you are having to comply with these multiple standards, then you can find some commonality between them. And the slide on the screen right now is a great example of that. Although incredibly simplified, what we tried to show you here is that these 3 different standards, right? One is the payment card industry standard. One is a European directive, so a regulation, a law in a particular region. And then SWIFT, which is actually an application standard. If you're a bank and you want access to the SWIFT network, which you typically would, then you'll need to comply with these standards. They're 3 distinctly different standards, yet we can find commonality between them. And in this case, what we've highlighted here is very, very simple. You need to have some kind of system hardening or secure system base that you can implement to show that a certain base level of security is being applied. And we were talking about this before we came online. This is not revolutionary. It's actually common sense. But it takes that level of integrated thinking in order to understand and join the dots between these siloed departments.
Excellent. Folks, keep the questions coming in. In summary, we're going to close the survey now, but 70% of you have more than 3. That's 4 or more regulatory industry standards that you have to comply with. That's very enlightening and very interesting, and very, I think from an operational point of view, it's very burdensome, obviously, and unless you take this integrated approach, it's not easy. I know many of you may be thinking, all right, it's easy to say. Folks, we are practitioners. Chris has been a practitioner. I'm still a practitioner. It's not easy. We understand. It's actually quite a challenge, but at least it's an aspiration. And if you work with your teams to try to find what is common, if it is common, example what we have here, this is one example, right? I mean, we also have, Chris, the CIPR training, and we've been doing an exercise, and pretty much almost every standard is asking for incident response,
Yes.
So that one training, that one approach pretty much actually handles a lot of different standards also. So it's really critical, and what we're going to come to next is what Chris and I did when we were planning this. We looked at 2 different but very important, very crucial to us. Cheap microphone. Okay, audience, folks, it's not a microphone. In fact, Bright Talk does not allow us internet dialing. It's actually, we're dialing in through the phone, so there must be something there. We apologize for this, but we'll carry on. It's not something we can kind of sort out from a technical point of view apart from talking to Bright Talk. So what we have done, folks, is we've taken 2 requirements. One is system application and hardening, and the other one is about secure file sharing. So Chris, what are we seeing over here?
Well, I wanted to put what we're speaking about into practice. So we just spoke about this idea of being practitioners. And of course, when we're going to identify a need, then of course we want to provide a solution to that as well. So I've just pulled out here PCI-DSS requirements 6.1 and 6.4. the NIST directive sections B4 and B5, and of course the SWIFT requirements to 10A. And you guys can go and read these things or Google them yourselves. But they all have that commonality that we're talking about, that integrated compliance, being able to apply that thinking to it. And essentially what they're asking for is for you to apply some kind of system hardening principle. So basically taking your operating systems, your applications, your network devices, whatever it is that you have within the scope of that regulation or standard, and effectively bringing it up to a known gold build or a known gold standard so that you can eliminate sort of 90% of the normal vulnerabilities and attack surfaces. And so there's lots of really good solutions that you can use out here. I mean, we've highlighted a couple in particular, but of course there's a whole market available to you there. But a great example of this is CIS benchmarking, and I'm not sure how familiar people would be considering the audience that we have, but CIS is an organization made up of security practitioners, and some of those practitioners are representing things like SANS, and ISACA, who we mentioned at the beginning of the call, so very well-respected organizations as part of this group. And what they do is they develop recommendations for configuring operating systems, applications, and network devices, so that you can ensure that when you're using these devices, they're operating at a level which security practitioners recommend. CIS benchmarking, it can be considered the gold standard of doing this. And if you look at a solution like NNT, and of course there are competitors, what they allow you to do is to automate that process of benchmarking, assess all of your devices, and then even apply remediation to those that maybe fall below standard. And I think something like that is a really good choice for procurement departments or even those silo departments, because it's complementing multiple standards and regulations. So not so much a sales pitch, but implementing something like a benchmarking system will allow you to comply with not just these 3 standard points here, but actually some others as well.
Yes, sorry, I've dialed out and dialed back in, so hopefully this makes a difference. Like I said, apologies to those. We're getting many feedback that people can hear us very clearly. So Chris, on the benchmarking, this is really crucial, and it sounds like a very kind of small thing to do, but when as a CISO, one of the things I see, and when we investigate incidents, we get called in to check and identify why something went wrong. A lot of the times it boils down to things like, the configuration build. I had a recent, for example, a client recently ran what we are talking about on the screen, and they thought they had their configuration under control, but it turned out they were only 46% compliant with the baseline. Now, it's quite important. That doesn't mean that it's good or bad, folks. It just gives a perspective, a baseline, a point of reference for you to build upon. You don't have to match 100%, but at least an approach like this, an automated approach, I must add very clearly. We did a webinar a few weeks ago, and there were 800 pages, Chris. Was it 800 pages?
Yeah, absolutely. So just consider that for a moment. If you've got, most of our audience say they have more than 3 standards to comply with. So let's just say 4. Let's say you have 4 standards. You've got 4 siloed teams, and they all come up against this requirement to make sure that their systems are being hardened to a known good standard. They'll all reach out to maybe somebody like CIS. They'll download a copy of the Secure Configuration Practitioner's Guide for a particular operating system, let's say, and they'll find that actually it's about 800 pages long. And if 4 teams are making their way through that document at the same time, this is where we get to this idea of there being inefficiencies when there is a lack of integrated compliance thinking.
Yeah, and just to remind everyone, 800 pages for one hardening. And
yes.
I urge everyone, I urge all my clients every time, even if you're not a client, if there's one thing you can do, please seek automation in as much activity that you can, especially these kind of very, very binary. The good thing about configuration change, folks, and configuration kind of hardening, I've just started a survey, Chris. Does your organization perform system hardening tests? So if everyone can please answer that. But something very, very important here, system hardening is one of those, fortunately, binary activities in cybersecurity. I urge everyone, and this is really critical in regulatory compliance also, but in general kind of cybersecurity hygiene, if you are going to do system hardening, please take an automated approach. Whether it's CIS, which is Center for Internet Security, I think, I keep calling it CIS, and NNT, which is what Chris was talking about, the solution that automates this activity. But if you want to do hardening, take an automated approach. You don't have to achieve 100%. You can configure what is good for you, but you need to define good, and then you need to measure all your estate to understand how good the rest of your organization is compared to what you have defined as a baseline. Chris.
There's actually a really good question from the audience. Do you mind if I answer that now?
Yes.
So somebody's asked, I think there's a spelling mistake in it, so I'll make an assumption that I know what they're asking about. But somebody's mentioned here, will you talk about offerings like GRC Solutions, so governance, risk and compliance solutions? And that's actually it's not something we're going to be covering in the slides, but I think it's worth spending some time speaking about, because actually one of the really good things about most GRC solutions is that they do offer integrated compliance. Most GRC solutions will allow you to pick and choose the compliance or regulation standards that you have to adhere to, put them into one management pane of glass, to use a marketing cliche, and be able to effectively integrate compliance from that perspective. So actually GRC solutions are very complementary to what we're speaking about.
And I think, if I may take that also, Chris, it's a very good question for another reason. If you are looking to buy a GRC solution, and this particular session today is not about that, you must ask on whether it can integrate with things like NNT or CIS, and whether it can then also give you and show you how you are improving. Because the biggest challenge, okay, there are a couple of things here, right, very quickly. How do you demonstrate your improvement? Now, if you have a GRC solution or you're looking to buy one, you need to be able to capture this data, whether it's through API or importing the data, but you need to be able to capture it over a period of time so that you can demonstrate, hopefully, improving compliance. Otherwise, you're back to square one, where you may be doing a lot of good stuff, but when it comes to complianceification, as the word that we've come up with, when it comes to that, it is really difficult to demonstrate that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're going to embark on the idea of integrated compliance, then you certainly should be looking at some way of integrating solutions like GRC Solutions and auditing tools like NNT or CIS together, because ultimately what you want is for those siloed teams to be able to access one portal where they can see the results of one scan and be able to attribute that to multiple compliance and regulatory standards. That's effectively what we're talking about here when we're saying integrated compliance.
Now, something very interesting on the screen, folks. It's 55% of compliance checks were kind of not, pretty much compliant, if you want to put it that way, but you can read what it says on the screen. Okay, on average, organizations fail 55. So again, I urge you, if you don't have to buy a solution, you can do this on the free, but try to take an automated approach and check how well is your basic build, your computer build, your laptop build, your application build. Something very keen to point out over here for everyone. Your application build. How secure is your Chrome application?
Yeah.
Now, something like, as much as I understand from talking to Chris, something like NNT will give you all of that additional context and allow you to continuously baseline how secure your applications are configured also. It's not just about operational configuration, everyone. Sorry, go on, Chris.
I was just going to say, also including in that mobile devices as well. Mobile devices have obviously become very prominent in the industry over the last couple of years, and CIS do produce benchmarks for mobile devices as well as database applications and browsers and operating systems. So there's a whole plethora of different types of benchmarking tests that you can run across all kinds of devices, and a lot of the compliance regulations, particularly things like PCI, are becoming mobile aware. They are starting to include provisions for things like mobile applications and remote working. So it is just a fact of reality that you will need to include those things in your tests as well.
Excellent. So what do we have here, Chris? The other thing we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, we wanted to include two examples of these types of tools or solutions that can provide integrated compliance capabilities, and we just focused on something that was very much, I guess, network and server-based or network device-based. But the other aspect is data security, and there's a good reason for bringing this up. Is certainly in Europe, the big boy in terms of regulatory compliance has been the GDPR over the last 2 years, and that's not so much focused on the sort of the build standard of your servers, but more focused on data security and how you protect personal data. And so just from experience that I have, again, just as a caveat, there are obviously other solutions out there. Do a bit of a BBC caption there. There are other items on the market, but my experience, I've worked a lot with Ipswitch, who, if you're not familiar with them, one of the things that they specialize in is the movement of data. And you can imagine that that's been a big conversation in Europe for the last couple of years. So, just taking a very classic example that I come across on a daily basis is organizations, particularly critical national infrastructure and anybody who's dealing with sensitive data, asking the question, what do we do with workflows which once upon a time were fine to be unencrypted or fine to be unprotected, but now we have to apply some kind of security and some kind of risk measurement to it. And a great example of that is email, right? I mean, how many email attachments do we all send a day, and how many of those email attachments potentially contain either sensitive material or personal data, depending on what you need to comply with? So, one of the things that Ipswitch is really good at is compliance, and particularly things like PCI, GDPR. They comply with almost anything NIST that comes out, being an American-based company, and some of the badges I put down there in the corner. But take a look at their answer to email attachments, right? So first, you want to send something with a sensitive attachment. You can still continue to use Microsoft Outlook or whatever your preferred email composition application is. It could be G Suite, I guess. And what happens is when you send that email, we don't interfere with the normal workflow. You continue to work as you did in the past. But when you send that email, we effectively strip the attachment out. We put it into a secure storage location, which is the Ipswich MoveIt server, or you can get the cloud-based version too. And in its place, we put a URL. So we effectively say to the recipient, you now need to click on this URL, this hyperlink, to come and collect this file from our Ipswich MoveIt system, where it's sitting nice and toasty and protected. And they click on that URL, they're prompted for username and password. They are also prompted for multi-factor authentication, because certainly for card data environments that are covered by PCI, you need to have MFA for non-console access. And then they can, once they've authenticated themselves and we're happy with who they are, they can go ahead and download that file. But there's lots of really cool technology that's going on in the background while that file's being protected. So, first and foremost, the file is always encrypted. And one of the real distinguishing features between Ipswich and a lot of its competitors, and I guess it depends on how important this is to you, but they use a completely different encryption key for every single file, which means that the risk is much smaller should one of those keys be compromised. But of course, compromising those keys is going to be a challenge anyway, because they place the keys into a tamper-evident database. And that tamper-evident database is hashed and sequence numbered, so they know if it's been tampered with. It makes it permissible in court. But crucially, and we haven't spoken about this at all yet, one of the reasons why a lot of my customers like using this solution is because a lot of them have to comply with something called ITAR. I don't know if anybody on the call is familiar with that, but it's for international trade in arms. So traditionally weapons, but actually a lot of electronic media is now considered arms because of the sensitive nature of it, and certainly any cryptographic material produced by national governments is now considered to be arms. So a lot of my customers have to comply with ITAR, and because of the tamper-evident database and all the protections put in place, ITAR is something that Ipswich Solutions are cleared for. So, without going too much into the product in more depth, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, again, if we look at this idea of integrated compliance and integrated security, something like Ipswich to protect data flows helps to complement multiple different mandates, whether it be GDPR, PCI, NIST requirements, Californian Data Protection Act, or ITAR, the list goes on and on. The crucial factor here is that it's not focused in one space. It's not about those siloed departments and that siloed thinking. It's complementary across the whole organization, which goes back to what you mentioned, Amar, which is what are the end goals? What are we trying to achieve?
Chris, thank you. A couple of things for the record. Chris is not an arms dealer. The last I checked, he does not deal in arms. He helps people who are dealing in arms. Okay, a couple of things. I wanted to give an example, Chris. Actually, recently, a client, they have a very robust DLP policy. However, what their departments actually needed was a secure exchange solution like what you are talking about here in terms of Ipswich. So it's very important to understand DLP is not secure exchange. Okay, so do take a moment, think about this. You may have a working DLP solution, and I'm not saying DLP is bad. DLP is very good, but this just brings into mind a recent client who actually required an Ipswich-like solution to resolve their internal business requirements rather than having DLP. DLP does not do encrypted, secure sharing of documents. So please, I know many of you understand this, but just keep this in mind, and if your business is currently doing this, maybe they need DLP and secure exchange of documents rather than just DLP. Okay, DLP is more of a protective data leak story rather than anything else. Okay, Chris, we're coming to takeaways, and I've stopped having sugar, but I love these images. They keep kind of enticing me to have sugar. But before you buy any solution, Chris, before anyone buys anything, what are the three things they need to do?
Yeah, so and I think we've probably spoken about most of this through the call, but we've spoken about a couple of products and tools, and of course there are others available, and there are other controls that you could put in place to maybe achieve something similar. So there's lots to think about there, but I think the first thing to do is to assess where you are today. So if you have 4 regulatory or compliance standards that you need to adhere to, how much of those are you currently adhering to today? I think that's the first step, right? Because we don't know where we're going to if we don't know where we're coming from. It's an old adage, and I guess it's common sense to a lot of people. I think the second thing then to do is to map out those compliance and regulatory requirements. So document them. What do you actually need to achieve that you're not currently achieving today? And get those down in a spreadsheet or something where you can compare them side by side. Because the third step is to then find commonalities in those particular standards. So just like we did a few slides back where we identified system hardening as being consistent between PCI, NIS and SWIFT, you'll want to be able to identify those areas where your particular standards meet.
Chris, thank you for this. But I do want to stress, folks, before you buy anything at all, understand the commonalities, understand, and I give this DLP example. I'm not saying DLP is bad for the record, but I repeat, understand what are you actually trying to solve. And yes, like I said, I also love auditors, but take a creative look at what the compliance requirement is saying, and then also, very importantly, when you're looking at a solution, one of the key things that, Chris, I'm a major kind of stickler for is how operationally friendly is the solution. It may be able to make you coffee and give it to you on the table, but if your operations manager or your operations team cannot run a solution, you might as well just kind of throw that money away in a bin or something. Very important, Chris.
Yeah, I think it's a very blunt point from me, but a solution is supposed to solve a problem and make your life easier somehow. So if by implementing a solution you're effectively making things more difficult, then you've certainly not made the right choice.
Chris, there's a question, and that's a good question from the audience. Keep them coming in. The question, Chris, thoughts about RMS, Rights Management System for secure email exchange, or I guess document exchange through email?
Yeah, so rights management systems are, if anybody's not aware, and obviously we don't want to answer a question that everybody else is puzzled about, but RMS systems effectively place controls on documents once they've left your organization. So, for example, I could send a Word document to Amar and maybe place a read-only control on it. So he opens up the Word document and it effectively acts like a PDF, but it's not, it's a Word document. So that's what an RMS system is, and obviously there's much more feature to it, but just keeping it basic. So I must admit that I'm not a big fan of RMS systems. I think that they are they're difficult to control for a start. One of the issues that you have with an RMS system is that if you were to send out a document with a particular control on it and then you decided that actually that recipient should have some more power, you'll have to go back and recreate that document and change the template that you've applied to it. So from that perspective, the solutions tend to be a little bit cumbersome. I think that in terms of regulatory compliance and standards, I think the best way to attack sending sensitive documents is to make sure that the communication channel that you're using is secure, that you've applied appropriate risk assessment on the people that are sending those documents. So if it's a HR department and they're sending sensitive data, they should be clear about what they can send and who they can send it to. And I also think that there should be auditing. Of course, we need to know who's sending out, what they're sending out, and crucially, an ability to recall. And that might sound like, if anybody's tried to use the recall feature in Outlook, then you'll know that it's never successful. There might be a couple of instances where it has been. But if anybody's ever used that feature, you'll know that the power to recall is really important and really useful. Getting a solution that can actually give you that capability and it works is a different thing. Now, Ipswitch actually, again, just to plug it, I guess, Ipswitch actually provide that capability, because consider that when you send that attachment, the attachment stays on a space that you own and control before the recipient comes and collects it. So in that time frame between send and collection, you have the right to be able to remove that file from being collected. In addition to that, you can put some controls on it too, like restricting the number of downloads and how long it's available for. But crucially, that file is in your control until it's taken away. Now, once it's taken away, yes, absolutely, an RMS system would be the only way that you'd be able to prevent it from being misused after that. But actually, I think that what's more beneficial is to focus on the sending aspect and the internal policies and the risk assessment internally.
Yeah. Sorry.
I was going to say, final point, in some regards, most compliance standards are not so, there is a forgiving nature to compliance and regulatory standards. There is generally an expectation that things will go wrong at some point. But if you've taken all the possible precautions that you could possibly take, then I don't think you're likely to fall too foul of whoever's upholding that particular standard.
Yeah, if I may add to that, thanks, Chris. To me, this is a requirements definition. What do you need? Do you need an RMS? Because RMS sounds really cool. For those of you who have used it, it can be very clunky. I know there are some kind of new products on the market that are addressing RMS's headaches. But the question, and kind of expanding on what Chris is saying, in my opinion, and the way I tackle this, is what is the requirement of what is the ask? Is the ask actually saying secure sharing, or is it, like as Chris is saying, life cycle management of the document once it leaves the organization? So it's a good question, and we could kind of talk quite long over it, but
Amar, did we lose you there? Oh, okay, well, we appear to have lost Amar, but I'll carry on. So the little view is telling me there's only one presenter, which is me. Okay. So yes, so just to continue on with the slide, so crucially, what you need to be doing is looking for the right solution that can provide you with that integrated compliance. Now, there's a couple of suggestions that I've put down the screen here, but of course, this could be tailored to your particular industry. Firstly, consider working with service providers and solution vendors. I know in a lot of senses, those guys are seen as being the enemy in some ways. And just sales guys out to sell you something. But ultimately, these are the people that have the experience. I mean, I'm here speaking to you today from the perspective of being a service provider, and you know, my multiple years of experience in the industry is something that you could benefit from. Amar, do we have you back?
Yes. Apologies again. Like I said, this was totally just a random disconnect. Yeah. So the final takeaways, like I said, folks, do your requirement analysis. Implement controls, what we say on the screen here, and honestly, don't go control crazy. This is another thing I wanted to share. Going control crazy it looks very good on compliance, but it doesn't actually make your users happy. It's a really kind of small thing to say, but if your users aren't happy, if your end user is not happy, he or she is going to look for a workaround. You may look amazingly compliant out, but your users are not going to be happy. We could carry on, but I wanted to thank the audience. If you do have any questions, the question on RMS was very good. Chris, do we have anything else? You want to say some final words there? Oh, there's another question, Chris. Have you taken that?
I have not, no.
One of the asks is encrypted email to satisfy the GDPR needs and implementing RMS has cost aspect that is appealing and meets the encryption requirement. Oh, okay. Excellent. Thank you for asking the question. So from my side, I'm not actually going to have much more to say. We obviously want to keep this short and to the point. I wanted to thank the audience for all their feedback. The quick survey response: does your organization perform system hardening tests? 75% of you, which is very good, perform some kind of system hardening tests. My takeaway is look for automation in things that are binary. Chris, what's your takeaway?
Well, for me, it's about implementing controls for integrated compliance, but crucially, not implementing controls at the expense of another compliance driver. So if you're looking at solutions or controls that maybe will complement SWIFT but will harm your compliance around PCI, then you should be rethinking.
Excellent. Everyone, I wanted to thank you. Do leave us feedback. Apologies for the audio. I do apologize. Don't include that in your feedback if you don't mind. we will speak to Bright Talk and try to identify why. But otherwise, thank you so much. Keep in touch, and we shall speak to you all again. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.